Welcome to panel discussion with three esteemed guests to talk about computational modeling and simulation and in silico regulatory evidence and the potential of this technology for the life science sector. And I'm thrilled to welcome our panel of experts, Professor Alex Frangi, Bicentennial Turing Chair in Computational Medicine at the University of Manchester and Director of the Christabel Pankhurst Institute, Sheena Macpherson, CEO of adsilico, Michael Kipping, who's the current President of TOPRA, a Director at Medical Technologies EMEAA at Element, and Professor of Practice in Health Technology Assessment and Regulatory Innovation at the University of Manchester. I wanted to start by asking you all, what do you see as the main challenges impacting the adoption of in silico regulatory evidence in the life science sector? And perhaps we could start with Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Anusha, and thanks for having me here. So a few months ago, about a year and a half ago, we actually did a survey to our community in the UK in terms of what were the main barriers and enablers for the adoption of in silico methods, computational modeling and simulation methods in regulatory practice. And the three things that stand out the most was the uncertainty that industry has about the fact that regulators may accept that evidence as part of regulatory dossiers. The second one was the perceived lack of trust or maturity of some of the models that are being developed. And the third one was the lack of sufficient skills in regulator affairs, I would say, not only regulators, but also people in industry that are dealing with the regulatory processes of these technologies. And I think this last one is largely, in my view, responsible for some of the other two. I think most of the models that have been developed are at different stages of maturity. Some of them are more advanced, some of them are less advanced, but that is almost proportional to our understanding on the mechanisms of disease and the way that certain interventions and therapeutic options work. But there are, let's say, while there are certain models that require a lot of work still, perhaps in both being developed and generating, the basic science, and also in generating their assessment, in generating evidence of their quality, there is also a number of other models that have been developed over the course of the last 20, 30 years that are actually quite mature. And in those cases, most of the problem, as I see, is that lack of skills and fully understanding of what they mean, how to evaluate them, what does it mean, trust as well. And the other aspect that I mentioned first, which is the lack of clarity on whether regulators will accept this evidence or not. In various interactions that I had with regulators in the US and in the UK, but also in Europe, the general sense that I got from conversations with them is that the current regulations actually allow, in principle, for in silico evidence to be presented. Because fundamentally, most of the regulations, what they say is devices need to be safe and efficacious, and it doesn't quite really specify the way that you demonstrate that. The problem is that some of these more novel forms of regulatory evidence are less known, they're less familiar for industry and regulators alike, and that is what produces that perception that this maybe that is not possible. So that's why everything that we can do towards facilitating the awareness of those technologies, but also, start addressing some of the practical issues with how to make them more available by developing best simulation practices, for instance, or guidelines or standards. All of that is always going to be helpful, I think, to reduce those barriers.
Thanks, Alex. And Michael, what are your thoughts?
So as an ex-regulator, fundamentally, we're kind of interested in patient safety, but balancing that with enabling industry to have clarity around the pathway to market and ensuring that it's cost effective for them to do so. So I think it's understanding and helping industry understand where this fits in their R&D journey. So for devices, broadly, we can think about safety, and that tends to be testing things in labs and benchtop testing in labs, and then performance or clinical efficacy, which is human clinical trials. So understanding where in silico can fit into that and what that looks like, by working with industry and also working with regulators as well to help them understand where it fits in, but also ensuring that we sort of co-developed the verification and validation of processes to ensure that the evidence produced is immutable, it's impartial, that sort of stuff. In terms of the theoretical benefit, it's massive. We have models already. We use animal models, we use human models. This is another modeling modality. So it's not about replacing and getting rid of any other models. It's about augmenting them where appropriate with this modeling. So regulators, typically are quite risk averse. So it's helping them understand. And I think one of the opportunities, the genuine opportunities that we have in the UK at the moment with being outside of other sort of regulatory jurisdictions is that we could look at a novel approval process. So we have ILAP for medicines and IDAP for medical devices. So these are the innovative devices access pathway, innovative licensing access pathway. So they could look at an innovative evidence generation pathway as well, and actually in a controlled way sort of look at the evidence generated through these modeling modalities alongside sort of more conventional approaches. So I think it's about really working in collaboration with both industry and regulators to turn it from really good theory into really good practice. And that will take time, but I think it's a really exciting time.
Thanks, Michael. And Sheena, keen to hear your thoughts and also about adsilico and your plans for the future in this exciting area.
Thank you, Anusha, and thank you for asking me to be part of the panel. So obviously there are, with anything that is new and is challenging the status quo, there are going to be some hurdles to overcome. And obviously Alex and Michael have already outlined some of the main ones from a practical implementation from the regulatory side, but also from the device manufacturer side. And we sit on the side of being an in silico enabler. So we're a company that is part of driving the agenda forward for the wider adoption and usage of in silico methodology to help accelerate medical device innovation. So what we're looking at is how can we work with the regulators. So the stakeholder collaboration is key, but also we want to be part of helping define that with them, because we have expertise, especially from the team perspective, that the regulators don't have. So we want to combine our expertise on how we know how to do things and how to do validations and all the processes that we do from a scientific perspective. And we want to work with them and see where the overlap is in terms of, well, how can we then adapt that for regulatory purposes? Because often they're not that dissimilar. Quality is quality. You want to be able to demonstrate that you have an audit trail, you demonstrate evidence for whatever your output is that you're trying to publish from an academic perspective, and in this case from a commercial perspective. So it is around the trust in those processes, and harmonization of those processes is going to be key, but it can't be done just with the regulators telling industry this is what's needed. It needs to be industry saying, well, this is what we can already do. Regulators saying, well, this is what the existing regulations say, and not just in the medical device space, but there's also AI regulations. There's huge amounts of AI regulations that have come more recently. And then looking at the more traditional clinical trial regulations and say, well, none of these are quite a good fit, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are elements of reuse within all of those things that we can then hopefully work with them to be the test case, to be the mock submission, to be part of the process, to demonstrate that trust that is needed, but also to help educate the actual regulators and the wider industry on what's possible. because many of them don't actually know. Most of the in silico work that's done in large medical device companies at the moment is in the early stage R&D. It's not part of their standard clinical trial process. And until we get them to the level of confidence that this is going to be accepted, then for them it's just an additional cost. Why would they do an additional cost if there's no guarantee that it's going to generate any additional evidence? So there is a key educational piece, and I think we can be a key part of the case studies associated with that.
Thanks, Sheena. And we had the pleasure of hosting the cross-regulator workshop in KPMG in our Canary Wharf offices. It was a fantastic day with the UK stakeholders throughout the sector, regulators and academia, as well as industry. And we were also joined by FDA. And I think that they're quite advanced in this space. And why do you think that that is? Maybe I'll go to Alex.
Well, I think it's because they've been working on this for a longer time, to be fair. So some of the people who are driving within FDA these ideas have been working in the sector of modeling and simulation themselves for 10, 15, 20 years. So that is the barrier of understanding and knowing how to do it. I think FDA, compared to some of the other agencies, has a massive advantage in the fact that they have also their own research laboratories, and I think that this cannot be understated. So a lot of the expertise that is being, in a sense, benefit from in terms of spearheading in silico methods is not coming so much or only from the regulatory side of FDA. It's coming from the R&D labs from FDA. And even themselves being part of the regulators, I'm sure they have their own challenges in terms of sort of raising awareness and doing that educational piece that Sheena was explaining before. But they also have some advantages in the sense that it's intramural and in the sense is easier. So I think with probably the pandemic and other similar situations that we had over the last few years with major problems with certain devices have all shown the weakness of the current system, and also the increasing pressures economically on the healthcare systems is showing that you can't just improve safety by just raising indefinitely the bar at the cost ultimately of the taxpayers. That you need to start becoming smarter, not only faster and sort of more demanding in terms of the regulations. And I think is that, and also, on the other side, it's true that nowadays we have a lot of new technologies that we didn't have, say, 10, 20 years ago. If you think about, Industry 4.0 in general and all the digitalization, the access to data, in healthcare as well. So all of those different trends somehow are there are things that are increasing the pressure of the system and demanding new ways of thinking, but there are also, new opportunities that are emerging that somehow are, helping to save the day. And it's about trying to navigate that opportunities and barriers and in the most efficient way, so that we shorten as much as possible this transition without compromising, patient care. Both in terms of risk, but also in delaying access to life-saving technologies, right, for them.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. And wondered, Michael, you alluded to some of the advantages, but it'd be great to hear more about, the real potential for this technology to really transform the life science sector. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that with our audience.
Absolutely. So when I was at the UK regulator, MHRA, my role was looking after a team focused on safety and surveillance. So all the stuff you see in the tabloid newspapers. Good day for us was a no news day, because it meant we'd dealt with the issue. Actually, part of the potential benefit of in silico is the ability to create that longitudinal data. So part of the drawback of in vitro testing and in vivo is you're looking at a specific time frame. With in silico, alongside registry data, it gives you that longitudinal view that can potentially give you signals of issues with a product or the use of a product. So that's a real benefit from a patient safety perspective. So that's great from patient safety. The other benefit from patient safety angle is enabling products to get to market. So we've seen in the EU that the thinking of, well, when there's an issue, we add more rules and kind of legislation, and we kind of see that when issues occur. But actually, we're in a position now where we've added requirements, and actually patient safety has been degraded because we've lost, or we're losing, about 20% of the products from the market. So those products are no longer available to patients. So in silico offers that opportunity for industry to kind of pick winners better. So looking at medicines, for instance, one in 10 actually get to market that hit clinicals, or that hit sort of phase 1 clinical trials. If you could increase that hit rate to 2 in 10 or 3 in 10, the competitive advantage would be massive. Equally, the benefit for patients would be massive because they would have more access to innovative products. So the potential benefits are there. It's kind of how to translate that into reality.
Thanks, Michael. And Sheena, in terms of virtual patient populations and generative AI, it's a really exciting area. Perhaps you could share some of your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of virtual patient populations, which can either be virtual twins or synthetic populations, which we refer to as virtual chimera, it means that you can take what the data sets that you had for a traditional clinical trial, and you can expand them to cover huge amounts of diversity and different subgroups. And this is something that is hugely important for the fact that there are so many devices that go through the regulatory process and then fail, even having gone through it. So if you can catch those subgroups early, or you can explore more scenarios, it means that those devices, if you bring in silico earlier into the process, are actually going to be released with a higher level of safety associated with them. So the virtual populations allow you to look beyond the data sets that exist, and providing that you're doing the governance and the frameworks that we've just talked about, it means that you're still creating something that's plausible and representative, but actually could have been synthetically generated. So the opportunities for the medical device space and the pharma as well is huge, because sometimes there isn't a possibility to run a clinical trial. So there's going to be groups of patients within the subgroups, such as children, or for older patients, or where there just of those patients for rare conditions to make it statistically. So you need to be able to have these other sources of data to be able to run your simulations, test for those patients, especially to make sure that, to encourage manufacturers to actually be looking that this is viable. You can go out, you can extrapolate, you can then take your data sets and then look beyond your initial indications. So there's a huge amount of benefit, especially for the patient, which is obviously at the heart of this in terms of patient safety. But there's also a pretty strong business rationale for making more strategic portfolio decisions from a manufacturer's perspective. It's also getting to the point where if the regulators have set up these processes and devices are still failing and still being recalled, how ethical is it for them to not be looking more seriously at the in silico way of doing things if there's a potential way to reduce harm and improve their processes overall?
Thanks, Sheena. And for you, Alex, so maybe you could share, what do you think are the most important next steps to increase adoption of in silico across the sector? And where do you see the technology and adoption over the next 5 years? And what will be the critical areas of focus?
So I think there is, I could talk about a lot of things that I would love to be able to do from a scientific, technical development of the methodology. But as an academic, I need to be also honest that the reality is we need to develop simple, albeit maybe sound boring, processes for validation, verification, and we need to co-create them across all the stakeholders. So, and that implies industry, regulators, academia, and also with some level of oversight and involvement from clinical specialists, and also with patients and public representatives, so that so that basically there is we bring along those communities as well in understanding what implications this can bring, also the potential risk, but also to make it more familiar to them, and raise the sort of the trust and the credibility in those. I think in particular I would like to highlight the importance of good simulation practices. There is a book coming up in terms of good simulation practice that was developed by the in silico world community in Europe, but with a lot of input and involvement from colleagues in the UK, colleagues in the US as well. The other area is the standards. So there is, as a concrete example of the influence they can have, the American Society for Mechanical Engineering developed in quite a few years ago a standard called ASME BMB40, that stands for validation and verification of computational models for medical devices. This went to be, it was co-created with some involvement with colleagues from the research laboratories from FDA, and now has become a guidance for industry as of November last year. And this is an example, of something that may sound boring, simple, it's a process, but it's actually quite important in moving the dial forward. And the other thing, the last thing I would say, or the last two things I would like to say, is one is I think we need to develop curriculum. So we are in there is a group of a community developed in the UK called In Silico UK, where one of the things we are looking is at what sort of skills might be required by regulators and regulatory affairs people in the future. And we are doing that again by conversations between academics, people from industry, regulators, to try to understand what is needed and what skills they have, what skills they don't have, and so that we can influence professional organizations to then define, minimum content for, curriculum that needs to be developed. And the last thing, which I think is probably, if you gave me a single bullet, that's where I would shoot it, would be to develop what Sheena alluded before, mock submissions. So maybe to expand a bit on that and unpick that, a mock submission is a pretend of a regulatory submission that is done possibly even on a fake device or a fake intervention, where the purpose is not to regulate that, of course, but is to actually understand all the pain points and all the challenges and hurdles across the whole regulatory pathway, and be used as a construct for bringing the various stakeholders together as a case study and understanding where the problems are. And this is something that was done in the US in some to some extent with FDA, and that was really helpful. And we are currently working towards developing a number of exemplars in along the same lines here within the UK as well. And I think that will, but all of these actions are all around bringing all the stakeholders together, developing a culture and a common way of thinking. Is not rocket science. There's still a lot to be done there, which I'm saving you for today, but it's actually that piece that might sound a bit less transcendental from a scientific point of view, but is fundamental from an adoption point of view, I think.
Thanks, Alex. Michael, do you have any thoughts on next steps, and what do you see for the future of in silico for the sector?
So I'll zoom out a little bit more. So the word regulation tends to trigger people to think about red tape and politicians saying we're going to cut red tape, which means, and the legislation is part of it, and there may be some opportunities with it, but I don't see many opportunities to tinker with legislation. Really, the opportunities for me are regulatory delivery, so how regulators actually license medicines or do conformity assessment for medical devices and speed those processes up. Also regulatory science. So this in silico falls under that umbrella of regulatory science. And we talked earlier about how the FDA have got a sort of a head start on us, and they do, and they're very well funded, but their drawback is that it's quite insular. It's them commissioning work to be done. And another positive development in the UK is that firstly, regulation is part of the discussion now in government, and not just legislation, but kind of regulatory science, so things like in silico and patient-reported outcomes and everything else that comes under that banner, like standards and skills. And the decision that's been made to create this regulatory science and innovation network to actually draw together lots of different activities under a banner, and then create some governance around it and actually sort of focus on that regulatory side and how we develop the regulatory mechanisms that we need for novel products. How, in silico aside, how do you regulate combination products? How do you regulate AI? This requires, for me, a collaborative working. It is done best when you've got some independent and neutral ground to have that discussion. And that's what they've gone for in the UK, which is brilliant, which isn't the case in the US. So for me, the decision sort of to actually fund regulatory science in general, I think is fantastic. And in silico as part of that is incredibly beneficial. And the last bit I'd like to see more of is helping companies navigate the regulatory landscape, because it's not something you do at the end of a process. But the submission is something you do at the end of the process. But understanding, what you need to know at different stages is really critical to your overall sort of business planning and R&D planning. So much more of a helicopter view, but I think the regulatory science and innovation focus is incredibly positive.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. And I think with the pace of technological advancement, more widespread societal acceptance of AI and generative AI, do you think, Sheena, that now is the time for in silico and we could see quite a rapid adoption over the next few years?
Absolutely. Obviously, from a simulation perspective, computational modeling and simulation is not new and is already used in other sectors such as aerospace and automotive in the design of devices. So it's commonplace there. I think that when we'd spoken to the EMEAA previously, there was a misunderstanding of what in silico actually meant. And obviously that alludes to part of the educational part that Alex has been spearheading in those engagements to make them understand, well, actually, it's not that dissimilar. And if it's already accepted as part of regulatory pathways for other sectors, why would you not do it here? So I think there's kind of part of, once you dispel the myths associated with it, then you open up the possibilities of what you could do with it. So I think part of the exciting part for the future is that we're actually part of having those discussions and driving. This is what you could imagine, that we have the regulatory governance and frameworks in place. Imagine that we've got the people at the table that need to be part of that discussion. What could we do? So it's kind of flipping the conversation do under the current regulatory process. Let's assume that the regulatory process is already there. This is what we can do, and then put in a regulatory process that is optimized that allows us to do that. So for me, the opportunities are, incredibly exciting because there's so many. But part of it will be to focus on the ones where there is the highest impact in terms of building trust in this process, in terms of demonstrating that this is going to change the way that medical devices and pharma products are actually developed in the future. This will, at some point in the not too distant future, and I appreciate there's a journey to get there, this become the norm. And they will laugh at us when we say, why would you not use in silico products? I can't imagine a time when we weren't, but we're not there yet. But we're already working towards that. And we're already working in a way that assumes that is actually what's going to happen. The journey might be a little bit bumpy, and there might be little processes that we'll need to go through along the way. But the opportunity for doing it is for the sake of the patients involved and the healthcare sector, which is obviously straining from, the costs of everything has gone up. There has to be more efficient ways. And if we can demonstrate the business model for why you would do this, as well as demonstrating the patient safety, then I think it opens up a huge amount of new opportunities that I'm excited to be part of.
Thanks so much, Sheena. And I I think just in closing, Alex, are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
I'd like just to emphasize what Sheena said, that the time is now to do it. I think there is a confluence of technologies and possibilities that we have today that were not before. There is also an increasingly awareness that there is no way we can continue the way we are doing things. And I think there is also another aspect that we haven't perhaps touched too much, but there is a need. I think there is an increasing awareness about the importance of health inequalities and that we need to deal with those. And we haven't touched that aspect, that most of the current randomized control trials have lots of design constraints that make that representativeness actually quite limited. So, you take them as gold standard, in many ways they are, but they also have substantial limitations that these sort of technologies could help to overcome by, for instance, building not only generative AI solutions, but also in the large availability of population studies like UK Biobank, or increasing amount of secure data environments like the NHS is driving in the UK, that allows you to have regional federated data sets on 3 to 5 million people population. So these real world data sets together with generative AI allow possibilities like, for instance, similarly to what we do with the hi-fi system, that we can control frequencies right from music to sort of enhance certain bands, could we somehow enhance as well those underrepresented communities so that we have more equitative evidence produced in ways that we will never be able to do in a regulatory trial, and also explore the designs in ways that actually we never were able to do before, at a scale we will never be able to do before. So I think it's an exciting prospects, and there is tons of technological challenges to address. There are cultural things that we mentioned that we need to overcome, but I don't think any of those are unsurmountable, especially if there is a community effort. And this is the other thing that brings me a lot of hope, the fact that there is this awareness, not just in academics or in regulators or in industry. There is a communal awareness that we need to do a change. And I think that is, everything where humanity has put its mind at work, and their creativity and ingenuity and faith as well, we always have been able to overcome things. So I think this is one of those that's I would say within the next 5 years, if this is not the norm, it will be the direction of travel that is irreversible.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks so much to our esteemed panel for joining us today for this exciting discussion. It's been my pleasure to work with you all over the last year and to be a part of some of these really exciting discussions that I believe will transform the sector in the not too distant future. So hopefully we'll continue to work together on that. And thank you so much for fantastic insights into this important area.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you all.